All right, so next I want to create an integration test. So integration tests are not like unit tests because integration tests depend on other external either services or components that are not in the class itself that you're testing. So as an example, I want to test this person controller flow where I send a request to this endpoint and it calls this method in service and this calls person repository and saves that data. And then I want to verify that the data was saved and returned back to the user. So to do that, I want to ensure a couple of things. I want to ensure that I actually hit this endpoint. I don't want to mock anything. I want to hit this endpoint. I want this endpoint, once my request arrives, to call this service. And then once this service is called, I want it to save to the database. And this database is called from this person repository. And I want it to save to an actual database, not an in-memory database. I want to save to an actual database. And this is the same database that I'm going to be using in my production. So let's say if I'm using Postgres in production, I want my test database to also be Postgres. And I'm going to achieve this using test containers. Okay, so let's see how this is going to be achieved. So I have this integration test package here, a folder, and I already have a package here called com code 215 Spring Boot testing. And I have a controllers package here as well that I'm going to create my test for this controller. One thing I wanted to mention is that I have this test config file where I've defined this test stress template bean, which is the client that is used to call the test controllers in Spring Boot. So this is a Spring Boot class. So I'm just creating a bean out of it by putting it in this test config and having it here as a configuration. Next, I'm going to create some controllers, a controller here, not some, but just one. And I will name it same thing as the controller. So I'll name it person controller, but I'll add IT, meaning integration test. And then I'm going to add a couple of annotations here. So the first annotation I'm going to add is a Spring Boot test annotation. And what this does is that when this test runs, it's going to create an application context. So all the beans are going to be loaded and it's going to be running as if it's running the actual Spring Boot app, but it's going to be running it in a test context. So all the features that I have in a Spring Boot application, I'm going to have because I have declared this as Spring Boot test annotation. And the other thing I need to declare this web environment attribute. And what I want is I want a random port to be created, meaning that whenever I am calling this endpoint in the test, it's going to generate a random endpoint, a random port, and that port is going to be used to direct requests to the controller here. So here I will call it Spring Boot test web environment random port. All right. So now I want to declare the URL that I want to hit. In this case, it is the person's endpoint. And we have it here already. In this case, it is HTTP localhost, and this should be, I want to declare here the random port. So how I do that is I create this annotation called local server port, and then I give it a name, port int, and then here I will replace that. So now when this test runs, it's going to, for it to hit this endpoint here in the test context, it's going to use the port that is defined here, and that's a random port. So that's how it's going to hit this endpoint in the test. All right, so now let's create the actual test function. So here, let's call it function test save person. And then I want to create a person that I want to save. So I will do the DTO, and I have a DTO here called person DTO. If you come here, that takes in first name, last name, and a UID. All of them are optional. And then you see here in the container, in the controller, that's what it takes in to save. So for mine, I'll have, again, the first name is John, last name is Doe. And then I have the response. I want to call that controller, so I want to declare the response entity here. And that's going to be based off of the test REST template. And then I'm going to exchange that, call the exchange method. I don't have this declared yet, so let me come here and declare it. So I'll do this private late init var and this test template. Okay, so now that this declared the test REST template, and then on to make the call to the controller. And how you do that is using this exchange method, and that takes in a URL, the method type, and the payload, and the response type. So the URL in our case is defined already, and the method type is post because that's what this takes. This controller takes in a post. So HTTP method post should be post. And then it also takes in the payload body in the form of an HTTP entity. And the entity type is person DTO because, again, that's what's here. That's the body type that's expecting. Request body is a person DTO. You can import this. And then in the constructor, I need to pass in my body, in this case, person DTO. And then finally, the response type, which is a person DTO. Because when they come here, we see the response entity type person DTO. So declare that class as well in here. All right, so this, when we send this call, our response entity should have a person DTO with our details. And so I come here. The first thing I want to do is assert that it returns the correct status. And here the status is created, which is 201. So I'll come back here. I want to assert that response entity dot status code. Let me import this. Is equal to, I'll just make this 201 because that's what I'm expecting. But then also I want to assert the first name and last name that come back. And I'm using tab 9, so it already has something for me here. Let's see if that works. First name, yep. And then last name, but then also I want to assert that the UID is not null, because I don't know what the UID is, but when we send it in, when we send the request, you can see here that first we see if the UID is not specified, it will create a random one. So I just want to make sure that that is not null. Boom. All right. Now, this is not going to work because I'm missing test containers. So test containers allow you to use actual containers in your tests. So in this case, I want to use a Postgres container. I don't want to use any like in-memory database in my tests. And then on production, I'm using an actual Postgres container. And then tests are passing, but it's failing on production because the test database I'm using has some nuances or some quirks that are not available in Postgres. So to help alleviate that problem, test containers come to the rescue because now I can use an actual Postgres container such that when my tests run here, I'm confident that when I run them in production, they're going to run successfully because they're actually ran on a Postgres container and not on an in-memory database. All right, so the first thing I need to do is add the test container dependencies to my build Gradle file. So I have this here already, and the version I want to use for test containers is 1.17.2. So I'll declare that here. 1.17.2. And then I'm going to use this implementation. So I have it here for Postgres. selected. Let me just refresh this to make sure that everything's pulled in, building. All right, so that's done. So next, I'm going to actually implement the test containers in my integration tests. Let's go back to the integration tests. And so now here, I want to declare some test container specific configurations, and I do that in a companion object. So the first thing I want to declare is a version of Postgres test container I'm going to be using. And if we come back here to my Docker file, I'm using 16.1. So that's what I'm going to use in my tests as well. So my version constant, which I'm going to declare, is going to be 16.1. So I have that. Now next I want to declare the actual Postgres container. And that takes in the image version. And then I need to declare some credentials. So the username, this is just random. I'll just call it demo. The password, again, random demo. And then the database name. Let me move this down here. Again, I'll just call it demo. And with reuse. So this can be reused. So I'll say true. All right, so I have the container declared here. Now, the next thing is that we're going to add these properties to the registry. So the next thing I want to do here is dynamic property source. And this is a static method in Java. So do this. So JVM static, and then properties method. And this is wrong. This should be the registry. And let me import this. And then I'm going to add the properties that I added up here. So we have registry.add. So I'm adding these to like Spring. The container, the URL, and then I'm going to add the username and password. Add. So Spring dot data source dot username, and then the password should be registry. And then finally, I want to like start this container. So I'm going to do before all. It's a static method. And start this method here using the start method. Okay, cool. Let's run this. Okay, it's an error here. Image 16.1. I think I missed something. Let me go back to the Docker file. Okay, I think I need to put the entire string here, Postgres : 16.1. So let me try that. Okay, that error went away. Now we have the test actually is failing. So let me come here and see status code. What's this? Oh, so I think I need to do dot value here. And I think that should do it. Boom, it's done. So the test is passing, and that means that it's using a Postgres container to save the data, and then the test is able to verify based off of the saved data in that Postgres container, Postgres test container database. So we have successfully implemented a test container for Postgres to save test data in it.